Hello, my name is Elizabeth Wheeler, and I will be presenting on the topic of the function of storytelling in relation to the human identity. Storytelling, in its variety of forms, can be used in countless ways. Literature is a very basic form of storytelling and is what I will mostly be referencing in this presentation. As explained by Northrop Frye in The Educated Imagination, storytelling is essential to discovering and defining personal identity. First of all, storytelling is about human identity apart from the rest of the world. Separating me from not me is the first step in identifying who you are. But Frye also says that storytelling can connect the two. We discovered that the language of literature was associative. It uses figures of speech, like the simile and the metaphor, to suggest an identity between the human mind and the world outside. Similes and metaphors compare things, saying one thing is like another, or one thing is another. In this way, they relate the human identity of your own self to the rest of the world that isn't you. Hearing stories about other people teaches us about ourselves, but can also make us feel better about ourselves, since we are not the ones making their mistakes. Paul Hernati, in his article, The Erotics of Retrospection, His Storytelling, Audience Response, and the Strategies of Desire, discusses historical stories and fictional stories. In talking about how readers relate to characters, real or fictional, in a story, he says, "Even when I follow fictive representations of actions, my attitude is not unlike that of the unobserved observer standing behind a two-way mirror. But such privileged status over other people actually believed to have existed will enhance my self-esteem even if, or rather especially if, I admire them." What he's saying is that hearing about fictional characters making the same mistakes as us, or mistakes that we've never made, gives us a feeling of superiority. That feeling of superiority is increased if we are reading about real people or characters that we know. If there are people we admire as well, then we feel proud that they have a fault that we do not have. This relates back to storytelling having to do with identity. It separates your identity from the parts of the world that you don't like. Northrop Frye, talking about a modern tendency to write about unpleasant things rather than optimistic things, says, "In other words, literature not only leads us toward the regaining of identity, but it also separates this state from its opposite, the world we don't like and want to get away from." By writing stories about unpleasant things, we can distance ourselves from them. Reading the stories about other people experiencing things that we don't like helps us think, well, at least I don't have that person's problem. In the same way, storytelling can help us understand others. Hearing a story is a way of hearing another person's experience. John D. Ramage says in his article, Curriculum and the Craft of Teaching Literature, says that the task of literature, or at least of literature as a discipline, is somehow to complicate us, not simply by projecting us into foreign minds and sensibilities, but by revealing to us the means of understanding and judging those minds and sensibilities. Here he says that literature gives us a way of comparing other people's minds to our own. If we cannot relate their minds to our own minds, then we have no way of understanding them. Stories give us other viewpoints and cause us to confront them and think about them until we can make them make sense in our own minds. The most obvious way in which storytelling does this is in expressing the storyteller's viewpoint. Every story has to communicate the author's thoughts in some way, because an author can't tell a story without his or her own thoughts. In turn, the author has been influenced by others and expresses their viewpoints. As Northrop Frye says, "A writer's desire to write can only have come from a previous experience of literature, and he'll start by imitating whatever he's read. An author cannot write anything without imitating on some level what he has already read. In this way, he shares his experiences with others." Frye continues that through writing, the author releases experiences and emotions that would stay trapped inside otherwise. By expressing the ideas, an author can make them more orderly and understand them more completely. Frye says, "For the serious good writer, it releases his experiences or emotions from himself and incorporates them into literature where they belong." Frye is saying that the author's experiences belong in literature. This is the idea that the storyteller's identity comes from storytelling. A person cannot have an identity without stories about themselves and about other people. Storytelling encourages learning, whether about ourselves or about others, but it also helps us apply what we have learned. Frye gives a way in which storytelling helps us organize things that we have discovered about ourselves. He says, "Our impressions of human life are picked up one by one and remain for most of us loose and disorganized. But we constantly find things in literature that suddenly coordinate and bring into focus a great many such impressions." Reading stories can help us take what we have learned what we have learned from various sources and organize it into patterns. Making patterns and connections leads to deeper understanding, which in turn leads to more discovery. Learning and understanding is important because it does lead to a deeper understanding of ourselves. Charles E. Winquist, in his essay, The Act of Storytelling and the Self's Homecoming, says, "Without a history or without a story, there is very little we can say about ourselves," and continues, "The natural self, stripped of its history, is neutral." He says that without stories, a person has no identity at all. Stories make our history and give us a way to tell others about ourselves. In conclusion, storytelling is necessary to the continual creation of our identities. We cannot have an identity to begin with without a story to tell. And in order to continue having an identity, we must discover about ourselves and others. And an efficient way of doing this is through storytelling.